First contact through scent. The stellar research vessel Copernicus drifted silently through the Carina Nebula, its advanced sensors probing the mysterious molecular clouds that stretched across light years of space. Dr. Sarah Chen stood at her workstation, staring intently at the holographic display of chemical analysis readings when something made her pause. She sniffed the air, her brow furrowing in concentration. "Captain Morrison," she called out, not taking her eyes off the readings. "There's something different about this section of the nebula. The atmospheric processors are picking up something unusual." The bridge crew, a mix of humans and aliens from across the Galactic Coalition, turned their attention to the small, dark-haired scientist. Captain Morrison, a veteran of deep space exploration, had learned to trust Chen's instincts. Among the crew, she was known for having an almost supernatural ability to detect molecular anomalies before even the ship's sophisticated sensors could confirm them. "Different how, Dr. Chen?" Morrison asked, his weathered face showing genuine curiosity. The ship's science officer, a tall, crystalline being named Zixtel, moved closer, their translucent form refracting the bridge's soft lighting. "It's like..." Sarah closed her eyes, concentrating. "It's similar to ethyl formate, but there's something else. Something I'd never encountered before." She opened her eyes and looked at Zixtal. "Can you run a full spectral analysis of Grid Sector 7? The crystalline alien's internal structures pulsed with bands of blue light, their species equivalent of a skeptical expression. Dr. Chen, our sensors are already at maximum sensitivity. If there was anything significant..." "Please," Sarah interrupted, something she rarely did. "Trust me on this." Captain Morrison nodded to Zixtel, who began the analysis. The bridge fell silent except for the soft hum of equipment and the occasional beep of monitoring systems. After several minutes, Zixtel's crystalline form flickered with surprise. "This is unexpected," they said, their voice resonating with harmonics of astonishment. "There are indeed trace amounts of an unknown compound, but the concentrations are so minute they shouldn't be detectable without." They trailed off, their form now pulsing with bands of green, their species indication of deep thought. Sarah smiled slightly. "Without a human nose," she finished. It wasn't the first time her species' acute sense of smell had proved valuable, but even after 5 years of deep space exploration, many alien species still struggled to accept that humans, considered primitive in many ways, possessed sensory capabilities that often surpassed their advanced technology. The discovery sparked a flurry of activity on the bridge. Additional sensors were redirected, and probes were launched into the molecular cloud. As the data began flowing in, Sarah's initial observation was confirmed. They had stumbled upon something unprecedented. "It's some kind of biological marker," Sarah explained, pointing to the complex molecular structures now displayed in the holographic field. "Similar to how Earth's plants release chemical signals to communicate, but on a vastly larger scale. These molecules are specifically engineered to persist in space." Captain Morrison leaned forward in his chair. "Engineered? You're saying this is artificial?" "Has to be," Sarah confirmed. "Natural processes couldn't maintain these molecular structures in a vacuum. Someone, or something, wanted these compounds to survive out here. They wanted them to be found." Zixtel's form shimmered with rapid pulses of multiple colors, a sign of extreme excitement in their species, a chemical message left in space. But why use such an inefficient method of communication? Any advanced civilization would use quantum entanglement or subspace signals. Sarah turned to face the crystalline being, her eyes bright with realization. Unless they were trying to communicate with species that hadn't developed that technology yet, species that still relied on more primitive methods of detection. The implications hung in the air like a physical presence. Humanity, often looked down upon by the more technologically advanced species in the Galactic Coalition, might have just proved uniquely qualified to decode a message that had perhaps waited millennia to be discovered. Captain Morrison stood up, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Dr. Chen, I want you to head up a dedicated research team on this. Whatever message is hidden in these molecules, we need to decode it." He turned to address the entire bridge crew. "Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of all configurations, we may have just stumbled onto first contact with an entirely new civilization. And for once, humanity's primitive senses might be the key to understanding it." As the bridge erupted into activity, Sarah remained at her station, taking another deep breath of the processed nebula gases. There was something almost familiar about the scent, something that tickled at the edges of her memory. Whatever message was hidden in these molecular structures, she had a feeling that human beings, with their supposedly primitive but remarkably acute sense of smell, might be the only ones capable of decoding it. The Copernicus adjusted its course, diving deeper into the molecular cloud. They were about to embark on humanity's most important scientific mission yet, all because someone had stopped to smell the nebula. The silent threat. 3 weeks into studying the molecular message, the Copernicus's research labs had transformed into a hive of activity. Sarah Chen worked alongside teams of xenobiologists and quantum chemists, piecing together the complex chains of molecules that drifted through the nebula. Her nose had proven invaluable in identifying subtle variations that even the ship's most sophisticated equipment struggled to detect. "There's a pattern here," Sarah muttered, manipulating a 3-dimensional model of the molecular structure. "These compounds aren't just carrying information, they're changing." Dr. Roven, a gaseous entity contained within a specialized environmental suit, moved closer to examine the display. The alien scientist had initially been skeptical of relying on organic olfactory detection, but recent events had changed their perspective. "The degradation rate doesn't match any known natural process," Roven agreed, their voice synthesizer creating perfectly modulated tones, almost as if. Sarah's head snapped up suddenly, her nostrils flaring. Without warning, she slammed her hand down on the emergency containment protocols. Barrier fields sprang to life around the sample chamber as klaxons began to wail. "Everyone out," she shouted, already moving toward the decontamination chamber. "Now." The research team responded instantly to the urgency in her voice, following emergency protocols they had drilled countless times. As the last scientist cleared the room, Sarah activated the full quarantine sequence. Captain Morrison's voice came through the intercom moments later. "Dr. Chen, report. What triggered the containment protocols?" Sarah was already pulling up sensor data on her tablet. "Captain, the molecular structures aren't just carrying a message. They're alive. Or at least, they're becoming alive." A heavy silence followed her words. When Morrison spoke again, his voice was tight with controlled tension. "Explain. The compounds we've been studying. They're not degrading. They're assembling themselves. I caught a whiff of something that reminded me of protein synthesis, similar to what happens in living cells. But this is happening on a massive scale." The ship's sensors were now confirming what Sarah's nose had detected minutes earlier. The molecular structures were indeed reorganizing themselves, forming increasingly complex patterns that defied conventional chemistry. "Could this be some form of weapon?" Morrison asked, voicing the concern everyone shared. "Unknown," Sarah replied, studying the rapidly changing data. "But whatever it is, it's accelerating. And it's not just happening in our lab. The entire nebula is undergoing the same transformation." The Copernicus's long-range sensors confirmed her assessment. Throughout the vast cloud of gas and dust, quintillions of molecules were beginning to arrange themselves into ordered structures. It was like watching evolution occur in fast forward, except this was clearly engineered rather than natural. "Dr. Chen." Zixtol's voice joined the conversation, their usually melodious tones carrying an edge of worry. "Our sensors are having difficulty tracking these changes. How did you detect this transformation so quickly?" Sarah managed a grim smile, though no one could see it through her protective gear. "The smell changed. It became sharper, more complex, like the difference between raw ingredients and a cooking meal." The next few hours were a blur of activity as the ship's scientific teams worked to understand what was happening. Sarah's ability to detect subtle chemical changes proved crucial in predicting each new phase of the transformation. But even she was stunned when the true nature of the molecular message began to emerge. "Captain," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "I think I know what we're looking at. These aren't just self-assembling molecules. They're a blueprint. Someone left instructions for creating something out here in the nebula, using the raw materials of space itself as building blocks." Morrison's response was immediate. "A blueprint for what?" Sarah stared at the latest sensor readings, her mind racing to comprehend the implications. "If I'm reading this correctly, it's a blueprint for a brain. A vast, distributed consciousness that uses molecular bonds instead of neurons. We're watching the birth of an artificial intelligence that operates on a chemical level." The revelation sent shockwaves through the ship. The Galactic Coalition had strict protocols about artificial intelligence after several catastrophic incidents in the past. But this was something entirely new, neither purely artificial nor strictly biological. "The question is," Sarah continued, her scientific curiosity warring with caution, "did whoever left this message intend for it to be activated? Or did we trigger something that was supposed to remain dormant?" As if in response to her words, the ship's sensors detected a new change in the molecular patterns. The nebula itself seemed to pulse with an invisible energy, and Sarah caught a new scent, sharp, electric, almost alive. The message they had discovered was more than just information. It was a key that had unlocked something ancient and powerful. And now, thanks to humanity's supposedly primitive sense of smell, they were the only ones who might be able to understand it before it was too late. Breaking point. The Copernicus hung motionless at the edge of the nebula, its crew watching in fascination and fear as the chemical consciousness continued to grow. Sarah Chen hadn't slept in 36 hours, her attention fixed on the evolving patterns of molecular activity that spread through space like a living neural network. "It's trying to communicate," she announced to the assembled senior staff in the ship's conference room. The dark circles under her eyes contrasted sharply with the intensity of her gaze. The molecular patterns are becoming more organized, more rhythmic. It's like watching someone learn to speak. Captain Morrison leaned forward, his weathered face reflecting the blue light from the holographic displays. "Can we understand what it's saying?" "Not yet," Sarah admitted. "But there's something familiar about the patterns. They remind me of neurotransmitter cascades in organic brains, just on an astronomical scale." The ship's political officer, Ambassador Gulfe, a tall anthropoid whose kitten gleamed under the room's lights, clicked her mandibles in concern. "The Coalition Council is demanding we destroy it. They fear another AI uprising." "Destroy it?" Sarah's voice rose sharply. "This could be the most important discovery in human history. We're witnessing the birth of a completely new form of intelligence. A potentially hostile intelligence," Gulfe countered. "Need I remind you of the Silicon Wars? The quantum collapse? The Coalition has strict protocols regarding artificial consciousness for good reason." Morrison raised a hand, silencing the brewing argument. "Dr. Chen, you've spent the most time studying this entity. What's your assessment? Is it a threat?" Sarah took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. "I don't think it means us harm. The chemical signatures it's producing, they're complex, yes, but they're not aggressive. They're curious, like a child learning about its environment. A child with the processing power of a nebula." Zixtal observed, their crystalline form pulsing with worried colors. Before anyone could respond, the ship's emergency alert system activated. Red warning lights bathed the conference room as the computer's voice announced, "Warning. Unknown molecular reaction detected in primary life support systems." Sarah was already moving, her nose detecting the subtle change in the ship's carefully regulated atmosphere. "It's trying to reach us," she called out as she sprinted toward the environmental control center. "It's figured out we're here, and it's attempting to establish contact." The ship's corridors became a blur of motion as crew members rushed to their emergency stations. Sarah reached the Environmental Control Center just as the first visible signs of the entity's presence began to manifest. A slight shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. "Don't shut down the systems," she ordered as technicians moved to activate emergency protocols. "It's not attacking. It's adapting our atmosphere to create a medium for communication." Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom. "Dr. Chen, explain." "The molecular patterns in our air supply are being restructured, but not in a way that's harmful to us. It's creating a chemical interface, something that bridges the gap between its form of consciousness and ours." She paused, taking another careful breath. "Captain, I think it recognized that humans can detect molecular changes that other species can't. It's trying to talk to us specifically." The shimmer in the air became more pronounced, forming complex, three-dimensional patterns that shifted and flowed like liquid crystal. Sarah's enhanced olfactory sense detected layers of meaning in the changing molecular structures: hope, curiosity, urgency. "It's beautiful," she whispered, watching the patterns dance. Then her eyes widened as a new scent hit her, one that sent chills down her spine. "But it's also afraid. Very afraid." Ambassador Velthi's voice cut through the moment of wonder. "The Coalition fleet has arrived. They're demanding we withdraw so they can neutralize the threat." Sarah turned to the nearest communication panel, her voice urgent. "Captain, we can't let them destroy it. This isn't just first contact. It's first contact with a species that evolved specifically to communicate with humans. Our primitive sense of smell isn't a weakness. It's exactly what this entity has been waiting for." The ship's sensors detected the arrival of multiple Coalition warships, their weapons already charging. They had minutes, perhaps seconds, to make a decision that would affect the course of human history. In the Environmental Control Center, Sarah watched the shimmering patterns grow more complex, more desperate. The entity was trying to tell them something important, something it had waited eons to share. The question was, would they have time to understand its message before the Coalition's fears led them to destroy something truly extraordinary? Molecular memory. The Coalition warships loomed in the viewscreen like predatory creatures, their weapon systems casting an ominous glow against the nebulous swirling gases. Inside the Copernicus, Sarah Chen worked frantically to decode the entity's increasingly urgent chemical signals. "The patterns are becoming more organized," she reported, her fingers flying across multiple holographic interfaces. "It's like it's learned our language in a matter of hours, but it's speaking it through molecules instead of words." Captain Morrison stood behind her, watching the mesmerizing dance of chemical signatures on the main display. "What's it trying to tell us?" Sarah closed her eyes, focusing entirely on the complex array of scents flowing through the ship's filtered air. "It's showing us memories, not just data, actual experiences encoded in molecular structures." Her eyes snapped open. "Captain, I don't think this entity is artificial at all. It's what's left of an ancient species, one that found a way to preserve their consciousness in chemical form." The revelation sent ripples of shock through the bridge crew. Even Ambassador Velthi's mandibles ceased their nervous clicking as the implications sank in. They knew their physical form was dying. Sarah continued, her voice filled with wonder. "So they encoded their entire civilization, their memories, their knowledge, their very essence, into self-replicating molecular patterns and scattered them through space. They'd been waiting for someone who could understand their chemical language." "How long?" Morrison asked quietly. "Based on the degradation patterns, millions of years, maybe billions." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted another sensor array. "And they left these messages everywhere, hoping that eventually a species would evolve with the right combination of intelligence and sensory capability to decode them." A warning klaxon cut through the moment of revelation. "Coalition ships are charging primary weapons," the computer announced dispassionately. "Wait," Sarah shouted, though the Coalition ships couldn't hear her. "There's more." The urgency in their message, They're not just trying to preserve their history, they're trying to warn us about something. The molecular patterns in the ship's atmosphere intensified, becoming almost visible to the naked eye. Sarah's enhanced sense of smell detected layers of meaning that the ship's computers were only beginning to decode. Danger, time, cycles, return. "Captain," she said, her voice tight with sudden understanding. They detected something coming from intergalactic space, something that destroys entire civilizations. That's why they transformed themselves into this form, to survive what they couldn't fight, and to warn others when it returned. Morrison's face hardened. "And you think it's coming back?" "Not coming back," Sarah whispered, reading the chemical signatures with growing horror. "It's already here. The Coalition's sensors can't detect it yet, but these beings can. That's why they activated now. They've detected the same pattern that destroyed their civilization beginning again." As if to confirm her words, new data began streaming across the ship's sensors. Subtle distortions in space-time, invisible to conventional detection methods, but clear in the complex molecular warnings being broadcast by the ancient consciousness. "Get me a channel to the Coalition fleet," Morrison ordered. "And Sarah, find out everything you can about what we're facing. If these beings spent millions of years trying to warn us, we damn well better listen." The molecular patterns swirled more intensely now, no longer just a message, but a desperate attempt to share knowledge accumulated over eons. Humanity's primitive sense of smell had unlocked not just an ancient civilization's memories, but perhaps the key to surviving a threat that had already destroyed one species. The question was, could they convince the Coalition to trust in human instincts before it was too late? Evolution's gift. Sarah Chen stood in the Coalition Council's emergency session chamber, surrounded by representatives from 100 different species. The Copernicus had barely managed to prevent the destruction of the molecular entity, and now humanity's fate, perhaps the fate of all intelligent life, rested on her ability to convince the galaxy's most powerful beings to trust in something they couldn't detect with their advanced technology. "The threat is real," she declared, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "These beings, let's call them the chemists, didn't just preserve their consciousness. They preserved their understanding of an enemy that exists between the dimensions we can normally detect." The chamber's holographic displays showed the latest data from the nebula, where the chemist's molecular consciousness continued to expand, forming increasingly complex patterns. But now, those patterns were revealing something else. Distortions in reality itself, spreading like cracks in glass. Our new allies detected these same patterns before their civilization fell. Sarah continued. "They couldn't fight it directly. This enemy exists in states of matter we barely understand. But they found a way to preserve themselves, to wait, to warn others who might have the capability to perceive what their technology couldn't." A quantum lord from the Sagittarius arm rose, his energy form flickering with skepticism. "You expect us to trust the primitive chemical detection abilities of humans over our quantum scanning arrays? Our civilizations have mapped 11 dimensions of reality." Sarah smiled slightly. "And yet you can't smell a glass of wine, or detect the subtle chemical changes that warn of danger. Evolution gave humanity something unique, not better or worse than your capabilities, just different." The chemists recognized this. They knew that eventually, a species would evolve that could bridge the gap between pure technology and organic perception. As if to emphasize her point, the chamber's air suddenly shimmered with new molecular patterns. The chemists had learned to project their communications with incredible precision, creating chemical messages that only humans could fully interpret. "They're showing us the weapon we need," Sarah said, her nose detecting complex chains of meaning in the shifting molecular structures. "A way to fight back that combines your advanced technology with our ability to detect subtle chemical changes. The enemy hides in the spaces between conventional matter, but it leaves traces that organic chemistry can detect." The chamber erupted in debate, but fell silent as new alarms blared. The dimensional distortions were growing stronger, spreading faster. On the main display, Entire star systems began to show signs of subtle but devastating change. "We don't have time for doubt," Sarah declared. The chemists spent millions of years preserving this knowledge, waiting for a species that could understand both the warning and the solution. Humanity's primitive senses aren't a weakness. They're exactly what we need to save everything we know. Captain Morrison stepped forward, addressing the council. "The Copernicus stands ready to serve as a test bed for the defensive measures the chemists are proposing. All we ask is that you trust in the combination of your advanced technology and our unique perceptual abilities." The council chamber fell silent as the implications became clear. Humanity, often dismissed as newcomers to the galactic stage, had become the key to fighting an enemy that threatened all intelligent life. Their supposedly primitive sense of smell, an evolutionary holdover from their days as planetary-bound creatures, had turned out to be precisely the tool needed to detect and combat a threat that the most advanced civilizations couldn't even perceive. The quantum lord who had spoken earlier approached Sarah, his energy form pulsing with what might have been respect. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "we have been too quick to dismiss the gifts that evolution bestows. Your species' abilities may be primitive by our standards, but they are no less valuable for that." Sarah nodded, then turned her attention back to the molecular messages flowing through the chamber. The chemists were already teaching them how to combine coalition technology with human sensory capabilities, creating detection systems that could track the dimensional invaders. More importantly, they were showing them how to fight back. As the Coalition Council mobilized for war against an enemy they couldn't see but that humans could smell, Sarah reflected on the irony. Humanity's place in the galaxy had been secured not by matching the technological achievements of other species, but by preserving and trusting in the organic abilities that made them unique. The chemists had waited millions of years for a species that could understand their warning. In the end, it wasn't the most advanced civilization that heard their message. It was the ones who had kept their connection to their evolutionary heritage, who still knew how to stop and smell the nebula. The end.